George Michael Steinbrenner III was one of the most polarizing and influential figures in American sports. Known simply as the Boss, he was a man whose ambition was matched only by his profound contradictions. But this is not simply the story of a baseball dynasty. It is a chronicle of an obsession with winning, told through three distinct wars he waged, one for the cameras, one in the shadows, and one behind the closed doors of his own family. Forget the box scores and the championship rings for a moment. To understand the empire, we must first understand the emperor, a man forged not in the ballparks of New York, but in the gritty shipyards of the Great Lakes, under the unforgiving eye of a father who taught him that second place was the same as death. George was born on the most American of days, the 4th of July, in 1930, in the quiet Cleveland suburb of Rocky River, Ohio. He wasn't born into baseball, but into the grit and grind of the Great Lakes shipping industry. The Steinbrenner family name was already a formidable one in the Great Lakes region. His grandfather, Henry Steinbrenner, had purchased a controlling stake in the Kinsman Marine Transit Company in the early 20th century, a fleet of freighter ships that hauled iron ore and grain across the vast, often treacherous waters of the Great Lakes. This was a tough business, a world of hard men, relentless schedules, and razor-thin margins. It was a business that rewarded strength and punished weakness. The company and the family's identity was then passed down to George's father, Henry G. Steinbrenner II. Henry was a man of immense discipline and a formidable intellect. He had been an MIT-educated engineer and a national champion hurdler in college. He was not a warm and fuzzy patriarch. He was a stern taskmaster who believed in a simple, uncompromising philosophy. You work, you compete, and you win. Second place was, in his eyes, a form of failure. This philosophy was hammered into his son, George. From the earliest age, George grew up in a household where expectations were sky high and praise was scarce. His father would often challenge him, both physically and mentally. There are stories of Henry waking young George before dawn to milk the family cows, instilling a relentless work ethic. He would race his son, a gifted athlete in his own right, and show no mercy. When George once bragged about hitting a triple in a baseball game, his father's reported response was a cold inquiry. Why wasn't it a home run? This wasn't just parenting. It was a form of training, a forging of a personality that would later define the boss. George learned that to earn his father's respect, he had to be dominant, he had to be better than everyone else, and he had to win at all costs. It was a lesson that would echo throughout his entire life, creating a man with an insatiable hunger for victory and a deep-seated, almost pathological fear of losing. This intense upbringing shaped George's early life. He was sent to the Culver Military Academy in Indiana, a place that reinforced the themes of discipline, hierarchy, and command that he had learned at home. At Culver, he wasn't just a student. He was an active participant in building the very culture of the institution. He played sports, edited the student newspaper, and absorbed the quasi-military ethos that would later inform his management style. From there, he went to Williams College in Massachusetts, where he majored in English and became a star hurdler on the track team, just like his father. But even in his athletic triumphs, the shadow of his father loomed large. After college and a stint in the Air Force as a commissioned officer, George was expected to join the family business. But he initially resisted. He had a passion for sports, particularly coaching. He took a job as a graduate assistant at Ohio State University under the legendary football coach Woody Hayes, another famously demanding and volatile leader. George saw in Hayes a kindred spirit, a man who commanded absolute loyalty and who believed that winning was the only thing that mattered. He later moved on to an assistant coaching position at Purdue, But the pull of the family business and the immense wealth it represented was too strong. He eventually returned to Cleveland to work for Kinsman Marine Transit, the company he was destined to inherit. Working under his father was no easy task. George had to prove himself all over again. He started at the bottom, learning every aspect of the shipping trade. It was during these years that he honed his ruthless business instincts. He forged a reputation as a ruthless negotiator, attentive to every detail and willing to make unpopular decisions to improve the bottom line. In 1967, Steinbrenner led a group that acquired American Shipbuilding Company, later folding Kinsman Marine Transit into it and transforming it into a dominant force on the Great Lakes. He was already a millionaire, a powerful figure in the world of shipping and industry. But George wanted more. He craved a bigger stage, a national spotlight. He had tried to buy the Cleveland Indians, his hometown team, but the deal fell through. He was looking for a new challenge, a new world to conquer, and in the early 1970s, he found it in the Bronx. When George Steinbrenner set his sights on the New York Yankees in 1972, the legendary team was just a ghost of its former self. Under corporate owner CBS, the team was mismanaged and reduced to a line item on a balance sheet, focused on cost-cutting over winning as their iconic stadium decayed. To make matters worse, New York City itself was on the brink of bankruptcy, plagued by crime and decay. The failing Yankees were a perfect reflection of their dying city. CBS was desperate to sell, but there were no buyers lining up for a money-losing team. Into this vacuum stepped George. He saw what others didn't, a sleeping giant of a brand. On January 3, 1973, he and his group bought the New York Yankees for a reported $10 million, but after financial adjustments, the actual net price was about $8.8 million. Still one of the greatest bargains in sports history. The reaction in New York was mixed. Who was this outsider from Cleveland, this shipping magnate who knew nothing about running a baseball team in the Big Apple? The New York press was skeptical. The fans were cautiously optimistic, hopeful that anyone would be better than the faceless corporation that had run their beloved team into the ground. No one could have possibly predicted the whirlwind that was about to hit the Bronx. George didn't waste a moment. From day one, he made it clear that a new sheriff was in town. He was not an absentee owner who would watch games from a distant luxury box. He was going to be involved in everything, from the signing of multi-million-dollar free agents to the length of the player's hair. One of his very first acts was to institute a strict grooming policy. No beards, no mustaches below the lip, and no hair touching the collar. Players like Thurman Munson, Sparky Lyle, and Bobby Mercer, who sported the shaggier hairstyles of the 70s, were told to get haircuts. It seemed like a trivial, almost comical decree, but it was a powerful statement of intent. It was George's way of saying, "This is my team, and we will do things my way. We will be disciplined, we will be professional, and we will look the part of champions." He immediately poured money into renovating Yankee Stadium, signaling to the city and the fans that he was committed to restoring the team's home to its former glory. But his most significant impact was on the field. He declared he would be a hands-on owner, involved in every personnel decision. This was a radical departure from the norm, where owners were expected to sign the checks and let the baseball men, the general managers and scouts, build the team. George had no patience for that. He believed he knew how to build a winner, and he was going to do it himself. This led to immediate and constant friction with his front office. He went through general managers and managers at an astonishing rate. In his first 30 years as owner, he fired 11 general managers. His relationship with his field managers was even more notoriously volatile. He saw them not as partners, but as employees who were there to execute his will. If they failed, or even if they disagreed with him publicly, they were gone. This created an atmosphere of constant instability and fear, but it also kept everyone on their toes. No one's job was safe, and the only thing that mattered was the result on the field. The most legendary and tumultuous of these relationships was, of course, with Billy Martin. Martin was a former Yankee player, a brilliant but deeply troubled baseball mind. He was a pugnacious, hard-drinking brawler who managed with the same aggressive intensity with which he had played the game. In many ways, he was the perfect reflection of George's own personality: passionate, win at all costs, and utterly combustible. Steinbrenner hired Martin for the first of 5 separate managerial stints in 1975. Their relationship was volatile and often combustible, marked by frequent clashes. They screamed at each other, they plotted against each other, and they shared an intense, almost pathological desire to win. George would fire Billy for insubordination or for a bar fight, only to hire him back a year or two later, convinced that only Billy's unique brand of genius could lead the team to victory. Theirs was a bizarre, codependent dance that played out on the front pages of the New York tabloids for over a decade. It was high drama, pure theater, and it kept the Yankees at the center of the baseball universe. While the managerial carousel spun wildly, George was also busy revolutionizing the way baseball teams were built. In the mid-1970s, the sport underwent a seismic shift with the advent of free agency. For decades, players had been bound to their teams for their entire careers by the reserve clause. But a landmark legal decision in 1975 changed everything, allowing players to sell their services to the highest bidder. Many of the old-school conservative owners hated this new system. They saw it as a threat to their power and a recipe for financial ruin. But George Steinbrenner saw it as a golden opportunity. He had deep pockets from his shipping empire, and he was not afraid to spend. He understood that in the media capital of the world, star power sold tickets and generated headlines. His first major splash was the signing of ace pitcher Catfish Hunter in 1974. Hunter was one of the first big stars to become a free agent, and George outbid everyone, signing him to what was then a massive contract. It was a clear signal to the rest of baseball. The Yankees were back in business, and they were willing to pay whatever it took to get the best players. But the move that truly cemented the return of the Bronx Bombers came 2 years later, in the winter of 1976. The prize of that year's free agent class was Reggie Jackson, a charismatic, powerful, and controversial slugger who had just led the Oakland A's to 3 straight World Series titles. Reggie was a superstar in every sense of the word. He was brash, quotable, and he thrived in the spotlight. He was, in other words, the perfect player for George Steinbrenner's New York Yankees. George pursued him relentlessly, wooing him not just with money but with a vision of fame and glory that only New York could offer. He signed Reggie to a 5-year contract, and the media spotlight on the Yankees intensified dramatically. The 1977 Yankees were a team of immense talent and even bigger egos. There was the quiet, brooding captain, Thurman Munson, the fiery manager, Billy Martin, and the new superstar, Reggie Jackson, who famously declared himself the straw that stirs the drink. The clubhouse was a powder keg of conflicting personalities, with George Steinbrenner often fanning the flames from his owner's box, leaking stories to the press and pitting his players and manager against each other. It was a chaotic, dysfunctional, and utterly captivating spectacle. And somehow, amidst all the turmoil, they won. They won the American League pennant and then went on to beat the Los Angeles Dodgers in the 1977 World Series. They repeated the feat in 1978, once again defeating the Dodgers. George Steinbrenner's vision, his willingness to spend, and his relentless pressure had paid off. He had taken a moribund franchise and, in less than 5 years, made it the king of baseball once again. He was the boss, the most powerful and famous owner in all of sports. He was on top of the world. But even as he celebrated, a storm was gathering on the horizon, a scandal from his past that was about to come back and threaten everything he had built. The New York Yankees were champions again. The victory parades had returned to the Canyon of Heroes in Lower Manhattan. George Steinbrenner, the brash outsider from Cleveland, had fulfilled his promise. He had restored the franchise to its rightful place atop the baseball world. He was more than an owner. He was a New York institution, a figure as recognizable and as polarizing as the city's own mayors. He was loved, he was hated, but he could not be ignored. Yet as the champagne flowed and the championship banners were raised, the seeds of a scandal planted years earlier were beginning to sprout. This wasn't a controversy born in the clubhouse or on the sports pages. It was a federal crime, one that would lead to a humbling fall from grace and force, the boss, into a humiliating exile from the very empire he had so masterfully built. The story begins not in a ballpark, but in the dark, paranoid corridors of Washington, D.C. during one of the most tumultuous periods in American political history. It was the era of the Vietnam War, social upheaval, and the Watergate scandal. In 1972, President Richard Nixon was running for re-election, and his campaign, the Committee to Re-elect the President, aptly and ominously known by the acronym CREEP, was engaged in a massive and often illegal fundraising operation. They were shaking down corporate executives across the country for contributions, blurring the lines between political support and outright extortion. George Steinbrenner, the head of the thriving American shipbuilding company, was a prime target. He was a prominent, wealthy industrialist in the key swing state of Ohio. He was also a registered Democrat, but in the world of high-stakes business, political loyalties were often fluid. According to later testimony, Steinbrenner was approached by Nixon's fundraisers and felt immense pressure to contribute. He claimed he was warned that if he didn't, his company could lose out on lucrative government contracts and face difficulties with federal regulators. Whether it was coercion or a cynical business decision, George decided to play the game, but he did so in a way that was blatantly illegal. Federal law at the time prohibited corporations from donating directly to political campaigns. To get around this, a common but illicit practice was the use of straw donors. A company would give its executives bonuses with the clear understanding that this money was to be donated to a specific political campaign. The company would then illegally reimburse itself. This is precisely the scheme George orchestrated at American Shipbuilding. Between 1970 and 1972, he directed a number of his employees to make contributions to various political campaigns, including Nixon's, and then secretly paid them back with company funds, disguising the reimbursements as salary bonuses and travel expenses. In total, he illegally funneled roughly $75,000 to Nixon's campaign. But in the wake of the 1972 break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, investigators from the office of the new Watergate Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski began to unravel a vast web of political corruption. They followed the money, and the trail led them straight to George Steinbrenner's shipyard in Cleveland. In April of 1974, just as the Yankees were starting a new season filled with promise, the news broke like a thunderclap. George M. Steinbrenner III was indicted by a federal grand jury on 14 counts, including obstruction of justice and illegal campaign contributions. The owner of America's most famous sports team was facing serious prison time. The story became a major media sensation, combining elements of sports, politics, and criminal investigation, all centered on Steinbrenner. Now he had it, for all the wrong reasons. George initially proclaimed his innocence, vowing to fight the charges. His lawyers prepared for a lengthy court battle. But as the evidence mounted, and as the Watergate scandal brought down some of the most powerful men in the country, including President Nixon himself, the pressure on Steinbrenner became immense. Facing the prospect of a drawn-out public trial that could end in a lengthy prison sentence, he changed his strategy. On August 23, 1974, he appeared in a federal courthouse and pleaded guilty to 2 charges: conspiracy to make illegal campaign contributions, and aiding and abetting the obstruction of a criminal investigation. He was fined $15,000 personally, a pittance for a man of his wealth. But the legal sentence was only the beginning of his punishment. The real judgment was yet to come from the man who held the keys to his baseball kingdom, Commissioner of Baseball, Bowie Kuhn. Bowie Kuhn was, in many ways, the anti-Steinbrenner. He was a tall, stoic, patrician lawyer who saw himself as the guardian of baseball's sacred image. He was a traditionalist who believed in the integrity of the game above all else. He viewed Steinbrenner as a vulgar, disruptive force, a man whose loud mouth and deep pockets threatened the established order of baseball. The two men had already clashed over a number of issues, and there was no love lost between them. Now Kuhn held George's fate in his hands. A felony conviction was a clear violation of baseball's rules, which gave the commissioner broad powers to act in the best interest of baseball. Kuhn launched his own investigation, poring over the court records and interviewing Steinbrenner. George, in his defense, tried to portray himself as a victim, a businessman who was shaken down by the corrupt Nixon machine. But Kuhn was unconvinced. On November 27, 1974, the commissioner brought down the hammer. He suspended George Steinbrenner from the day-to-day operations of the New York Yankees for 2 years, though the suspension was reduced and he returned in March 1976 after serving about 15 months. It was a stunning and unprecedented blow. Never before had an owner been forced out of the game for misconduct outside of baseball. George was apoplectic. He railed against the decision, calling it a gross injustice. He filed lawsuits to try and overturn the suspension, but he failed. He was officially in exile, barred from the stadium, from the front office, from any involvement with the team he had so dramatically resurrected. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in being the boss, this was the ultimate humiliation. He was forced to hand over control of the team to his general manager, Gabe Paul. For the next 15 months, George was barred from the Yankees' operations, stripped of the authority that had defined his role. He spent his time in exile, fuming, plotting, and trying to pull the strings from afar. He would call Gabe Paul at all hours of the day and night, offering suggestions and demanding information. He was a shadow owner, a ghost in the machine. But his absence did have one unintended positive consequence. With George out of the picture, Gabe Paul and the rest of the baseball people in the front office were free to do their jobs without constant interference. It was during this period that they laid the groundwork for the championship teams to come, making shrewd trades and developing the team's core. When George finally returned in the spring of 1976, he was not a changed man. He wasn't humbled or chastened. If anything, the experience had made him even more defiant, more convinced that he, and only he, knew how to run the Yankees. His return coincided with the dawning of the free agency era, and he immediately reasserted his control, culminating in the signing of Reggie Jackson and the back-to-back World Series titles in '77 and '78. In his mind, the lesson was clear. When he was in charge, the Yankees won. His conviction and suspension were just a bump in the road, an injustice he had overcome through sheer force of will. And for years, he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to clear his name. His quest for vindication finally ended on January 19th, 1989, when, in one of his final acts in office, President Ronald Reagan granted George Steinbrenner a full and unconditional pardon. The boss had beaten the system. His criminal record was officially wiped clean. But before the pardon, back in the late 1970s, George's return from suspension kicked off the most chaotic and memorable period in the team's history, the era of the Bronx Zoo. The team was a combustible mix of talent and ego, and George was the zookeeper who seemed to enjoy rattling the cages. The clubhouse was torn apart by factions. The primary feud was between the team's established leader, the gruff and beloved catcher Thurman Munson, and the flamboyant newcomer Reggie Jackson. Munson, the quiet captain, resented Reggie's swagger and his constant need for the spotlight. Reggie in turn felt that Munson and other veterans were trying to undermine him. George, rather than calming the waters, often made things worse. He would praise one player to the media while criticizing another, keeping everyone off balance. The tension boiled over into a legendary public spectacle on June 18, 1977, during a nationally televised game against the rival Boston Red Sox at Fenway Park. Manager Billy Martin, believing that Reggie hadn't hustled on a fly ball, sent a substitute out to right field to replace him in the middle of the inning. Reggie was incensed. As he jogged back to the dugout, he and Martin began screaming at each other. The argument escalated into a near brawl right there in the dugout, with coaches having to physically restrain the two men. The confrontation was broadcast live into the living rooms of millions of Americans, a raw portrait of the team's internal turmoil. It perfectly encapsulated the drama of the Bronx Zoo. Through it all, they kept winning. But the era came to a tragic and abrupt end on August 2, 1979. Thurman Munson, an accomplished pilot who often flew home to his family in Ohio on off days, was practicing landings in his private jet when it crashed short of the runway. The Yankees captain was killed. He was just 32 years old. The news devastated the team and the entire city. Munson was the heart and soul of the Yankees, the gritty leader who held the dysfunctional team together. In the face of this profound tragedy, George Steinbrenner showed a side of himself that the public rarely saw. He set aside the bluster and the controversies and acted with genuine grace and compassion. He immediately flew to Canton, Ohio to be with Munson's widow, Diana. The day of the funeral was a game day for the Yankees. George announced that the entire team would be flying to Ohio on his private jet to attend the service. They flew to Canton, mourned their captain, and then flew back to New York just in time to play a nationally televised game against the Baltimore Orioles that night. In a tear-jerking storybook moment, the team, emotionally and physically exhausted, won the game 5-4, with Munson's best friend Bobby Mercer driving in all 5 runs. It was a poignant tribute, a moment of profound unity in the wake of unimaginable loss, all orchestrated by the boss. Munson's death marked the end of an era. The core of the championship teams began to age, and the magic of the late 70s faded. As the calendar turned to the 1980s, the Yankees entered a new and frustrating chapter. George, determined to buy another championship, continued to spend lavishly. His biggest acquisition came in the winter of 1980, signing free agent outfielder Dave Winfield to the richest contract in sports history, a 10-year, $23 million deal. Winfield was a phenomenal athlete, a future Hall of Famer who could hit for power, run, and play stellar defense. George saw him as the next great Yankee superstar, the man who would lead the team to a new decade of dominance. The relationship, however, would curdle into one of the most bitter and toxic feuds in sports history. The first cracks appeared in the 1981 World Series. The Yankees, in a strike-shortened season, once again faced the Los Angeles Dodgers. It was a rematch of the 77 and 78 classics, but this time the Dodgers prevailed. The GOAT of the series, in the eyes of many, was the team's new superstar. Dave Winfield had a miserable series, managing just one single in 22 at-bats. George Steinbrenner, who had just committed a fortune to the man, was publicly and privately apoplectic. Shortly after the series loss, he issued a bizarre passive-aggressive public apology to the fans of New York, without naming Winfield directly, but leaving no doubt who he blamed. It was then that Steinbrenner derisively nicknamed Dave Winfield Mr. May, contrasting his poor World Series performance with Reggie Jackson's reputation as Mr. October. This public humiliation was the opening salvo in a war that would last for nearly a decade. George came to resent Winfield and his massive contract, particularly a cost of living clause that caused the value of the deal to escalate far beyond the original $23 million. He criticized Winfield's performance, questioned his leadership, and constantly complained about his salary. The animosity was mutual. Winfield grew to despise playing for a man who so clearly and publicly disrespected him. The 1980s devolved into a frustrating decade of high-priced mediocrity. Despite stars like Don Mattingly, the Yankees failed to win a single pennant. George's frantic meddling created a revolving door for managers. Even the beloved Yogi Berra was promised a full season, only to be unceremoniously fired by a subordinate after just 16 games. But these were just symptoms of a deeper dysfunction. The true story of the decade was George's festering personal war against his own superstar, Dave Winfield. The decade was a long, frustrating wilderness for the franchise. The owner was at war with his highest-paid player. The managers were in a constant state of anxiety, knowing the axe could fall at any moment. The team was good, but never good enough. The pressure cooker was building. George Steinbrenner's obsession with winning and his fury at being unable to do so was pushing him to the brink. His bitter personal vendetta against Dave Winfield was festering, escalating toward a shocking and unethical act, a desperate gamble that would result in a second, even more devastating scandal, and a punishment that threatened to end his career in baseball for good. The 1980s were a long, barren winter for George Steinbrenner and the New York Yankees. The decade that had begun with the record-breaking signing of Dave Winfield ended without a single trip to the World Series. For an owner as singularly obsessed with winning as George, this was an unbearable drought, a personal and professional failure that gnawed at him daily. His frustration manifested in a chaotic, revolving door of managers and a series of impulsive, often ill-advised trades. But the true focal point of his rage, the symbol of his decade-long failure, was the man wearing number 31 in right field. The feud with Dave Winfield had moved far beyond a simple disagreement over money or performance. It had become a deeply personal, all-consuming vendetta. The legal battleground for this war was the Dave Winfield Foundation. When Winfield signed his monumental contract in 1980, a unique clause was included. The Yankees organization was obligated to make an annual contribution to Winfield's charitable foundation, which worked to provide opportunities for underprivileged children. It was a philanthropic gesture meant to burnish the images of both the player and the team. But in the hands of a furious George Steinbrenner, it became a weapon. As his relationship with Winfield deteriorated, George began to withhold the contractually obligated payments. He claimed, without substantial evidence, that the foundation was being mismanaged and that funds were being misappropriated. He wasn't just refusing to pay, he was actively trying to destroy the reputation of his star player's charitable work. This led to a flurry of lawsuits and countersuits that dragged on for years. The dirty laundry of the Yankees owner and his highest-paid player was aired in public court filings. It was an ugly, unprecedented spectacle. George used his powerful connections in the New York media to wage a relentless PR war against Winfield. He would leak stories to friendly reporters questioning Winfield's character, his heart, and his commitment to the team. He painted Winfield as a greedy, selfish player who cared more about his contract and his foundation than he did about winning. For his part, Winfield was caught in an impossible situation. He continued to put up all-star numbers year after year, playing through injuries and the constant stress of his owner's public attacks. He was a model of professionalism on the field, but the endless conflict took its toll. The clubhouse became a toxic environment, with players forced to navigate the treacherous political landscape created by the owner's open warfare against one of their own. Don Mattingly, the quiet, homegrown captain and the undisputed heart of the team, was often put in the agonizing position of trying to mediate a conflict between the man who signed his paychecks and one of the team's most productive players. For George, this was no longer about business. It was an obsession. He felt that Winfield, with his ironclad contract and his refusal to back down, had made a fool of him. In George's world, built on the principle of absolute dominance, this was an unforgivable sin. He couldn't fire Winfield because of his guaranteed contract, and he couldn't beat him in court. So he decided to fight dirty. He was determined to find something, anything that would ruin Dave Winfield for good. In his search for an advantage, he turned to Howard Spira, a troubled man with a gambling problem and prior ties to Winfield. Howard Spira was not just a small-time gambler, as he was often described. He was a man who had once been on the inside of Winfield's world. In the early 80s, Spira had done some public relations work for the Winfield Foundation. He was a hanger-on, a man who saw in Winfield a ticket to the good life, but the relationship soured. Spira, who had a serious gambling problem and was deeply in debt, claimed Winfield owed him money. He began harassing the outfielder, making threats and demanding payment. He was a man with a massive grudge and a desperate need for cash. This made him both dangerous and, to a man like George Steinbrenner, incredibly useful. Sensing an opportunity, Spira reached out to Steinbrenner's organization. He claimed to have explosive, damaging information about Dave Winfield and the inner workings of his foundation. He promised dirt that would not only help George win his legal battles, but would also humiliate Winfield publicly. For a man as consumed by his vendetta as George, this was an irresistible offer. The sordid deal was consummated in January of 1990 in Steinbrenner's office at the headquarters of American Shipbuilding in Tampa, Florida. He met with Spira and ultimately paid him $40,000, though some reports suggest he initially discussed a larger sum. It was an unethical and career-threatening decision. The owner of the New York Yankees, a pillar of Major League Baseball, was now in business with a known gambler, paying him to spy on and smear his own star player. George would later try to justify the payment with a series of flimsy and contradictory excuses. He claimed Spira was threatening his family and that the payment was a form of protection. He argued that, as a defendant in a lawsuit brought by Winfield, he was entitled to hire private investigators. But no one, least of all the commissioner of baseball, would buy it. The truth was plain and simple. This was hush money, a payoff to a shady character in exchange for ammunition in a personal war. George's pact with the devil backfired almost immediately. Howard Spira was not a reliable or discreet operative. He was a volatile and unstable man. After receiving the money, he didn't just quietly feed information to George's lawyers. He continued his campaign of harassment against Winfield, and he began talking. He boasted to friends and associates about his arrangement with the famous Yankees owner. The story of the payoff began to leak, and the whispers grew into a roar that eventually reached the highest levels of Major League Baseball. The man sitting in the commissioner's chair at the time was Fay Vincent. Vincent had taken over after the sudden death of his predecessor and close friend Bart Giamatti. Like Giamatti, who had famously banned Pete Rose from baseball for gambling, Vincent was a man of stern principle and a fierce defender of the game's integrity. He was a Yale-educated lawyer who had served as the president of Columbia Pictures, and he was not intimidated by powerful figures like George Steinbrenner. When the allegations of the payment to Spira landed on his desk, he knew he was facing a crisis that went to the very core of the sport's ethical foundation. An owner associating with a gambler to undermine a player was one of the most serious offenses imaginable. Vincent launched a full and thorough investigation. His team of investigators left no stone unturned. They interviewed Steinbrenner, Winfield, Spira, and dozens of other witnesses. They subpoenaed phone records and financial documents. George's story began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. His claims that the payment was for protection were contradicted by the testimony of his own employees. He was caught in a web of his own lies. The investigation painted a clear and damning picture. George Steinbrenner had paid a gambler $40,000 to dig up dirt on one of his players. He had abused his power as an owner and had brought disrepute upon the game. Fay Vincent knew he had to act decisively. He summoned Steinbrenner for a series of meetings. The showdowns were reportedly tense and confrontational. George, accustomed to bullying and intimidating his way to victory, had finally met a man he could not bend to his will. Vincent was resolute. He had the evidence, and he was prepared to deliver a punishment that would send a shockwave through the entire sports world. On July 30th, 1990, Commissioner Fay Vincent banned George Steinbrenner from involvement in the day-to-day operations of the Yankees, describing the punishment as permanent. Though he was reinstated in 1993, the ruling was scathing. Vincent wrote that Steinbrenner's conduct was reprehensible and that his association with Spira was the equivalent of a mortal sin in baseball. He was allowed to retain his financial interest in the team, but he was ordered to resign his position as managing general partner. He was, for all intents and purposes, kicked out of baseball for life. The news was a bombshell. It was the ultimate fall from grace for the boss. His first suspension by Bowie Kuhn had been for a crime committed outside of baseball. This was different. This was a crime against the game itself. He had been found guilty of a vindictive and unethical plot against one of his own players, a fundamental betrayal of the trust that is supposed to exist between an owner and his team. He became the only owner in the history of the sport to be disciplined twice for major offenses. As George retreated into his second, more profound exile, the team he left behind was a wreck. The 1990 Yankees were a terrible last-place club, a fitting symbol of their disgraced owner. The once proud franchise was at its lowest point since the pre-Steinbrenner CBS years. His legacy seemed to be permanently shattered. He was no longer the brilliant, if irascible, architect of champions. He was a pariah, a man whose colossal ego and obsessive need to win had finally led to his own self-destruction. This time there seemed to be no way back. The ban was for life. His career in baseball was over, or so it seemed. For even as he was cast out into the wilderness, humbled and defeated, the gears of his next act were already turning. He would, of course, begin plotting a return, lobbying for reinstatement behind the scenes. And far away from the headlines and the scandals, down in the minor league outposts of the Yankees farm system, a new generation of players was quietly honing their skills. A slick-fielding shortstop from Kalamazoo, Michigan, a lanky pitcher from Panama with a devastating cutter, a fiery catcher from Puerto Rico, and a steady left-hander from Texas. No one knew it at the time, but these young men cultivated during George's absence would become the foundation of a new dynasty, a team so great that it would not only return the Yankees to glory, but would also, improbably, salvage the tattered legacy of the boss himself. Steinbrenner once again found himself barred from baseball, a status that had become familiar in his career. In 1990, for the second time in his tumultuous career, he was a man without a team to run, an emperor banished from his own empire. The lifetime ban handed down by Commissioner Fay Vincent was a public shaming of the highest order, a seemingly permanent black mark on his legacy. The team he left behind was a shell of its former self, stumbling to a last-place finish, the worst Yankees record in nearly 80 years. From his forced isolation in Tampa, the boss could only watch as the franchise he had built into a global brand crumbled. To the outside world, it looked like the end. But in the power vacuum left by George's departure, a quiet revolution was beginning, one that would change the course of the franchise forever. With Steinbrenner sidelined, a new man was in charge of baseball operations, Gene "Stick" Michael. A former Yankees player and manager, Michael was a quintessential baseball man, knowledgeable, patient, and respected throughout the game. He had served under George for years, often clashing with the owner's impulsive desire for quick fixes. Michael had long believed that the key to sustained success was not constantly trading for aging veterans, but patiently drafting and developing a core of homegrown players. Now, free from the owner's constant win-now meddling, he finally had the chance to put his philosophy into practice. Gene Michael's strategy was the complete antithesis of the Steinbrenner model. He instructed his scouts to prioritize talent and character, and he made it clear that the organization's top prospects would no longer be dangled as trade bait for a fading superstar. He began methodically rebuilding the team's farm system, which had been pillaged for years to satisfy George's whims. And in a remarkable stroke of fortune and foresight, during this brief window of front office sanity, the Yankees acquired the foundation of a dynasty. In 1990, the same year George was banned, the team signed an unheralded amateur free agent from a small fishing village in Panama, a skinny right-hander named Mariano Rivera. They used a 22nd round draft pick on a gritty left-handed pitcher from Texas named Andy Petite, and a 24th round pick on a fiery switch-hitting catcher from Puerto Rico named Jorge Posada. In 1985, they had signed a graceful switch-hitting center fielder from Puerto Rico named Bernie Williams. Then, in the 1992 amateur draft, came the crown jewel. With the 6th overall pick, the Yankees selected a high school shortstop from Kalamazoo, Michigan. His name was Derek Jeter. The team's head of scouting, Dick Groch, was so convinced of Jeter's potential that he reportedly threatened to quit if the team didn't draft him. Thankfully, the 5 teams picking ahead of the Yankees all passed on the future captain. These players, Jeter, Rivera, Petita, Posada, and Williams, were the product of patience, a concept entirely foreign to George Steinbrenner. They were nurtured in the minor leagues, allowed to develop without the immense pressure of the New York spotlight. Meanwhile, George was far from idle in his exile. He waged a relentless, behind-the-scenes campaign for his reinstatement. He wrote letters of apology, expressed public contrition, and leveraged his immense influence among the other MLB owners, many of whom were his allies, and resented what they saw as the commissioner's overreach. The pressure on Fay Vincent became immense. In a move that would ultimately contribute to his own downfall, Vincent buckled. After 2.5 years, on March 1st, 1993, George Steinbrenner's lifetime ban was lifted. When he returned, he made a great show of being a changed man. He gave interviews proclaiming that he had learned his lesson, that he would no longer interfere, that he would trust the baseball people to do their jobs. "You'll see a new George, a different George," he promised. The New York press was deeply skeptical, but to the astonishment of many, he largely kept his word. Perhaps the public humiliation had genuinely chastened him, or perhaps he simply recognized the incredible pool of young talent that Gene Michael had assembled in his absence. Whatever the reason, he took a step back. The final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The team acquired the fiery, intense outfielder Paul O'Neill in a trade with the Cincinnati Reds. They signed a big-ticket free agent in ace pitcher David Cone. All they needed was the right leader in the dugout to guide this potent mix of hungry young prospects and savvy veterans. In late 1995, George made one of the most inspired and unlikely decisions of his entire career. He hired Joe Torre to be the next manager of the New York Yankees. The reaction from the New York media was brutal and immediate. "Clueless Joe," screamed the back page of the New York Daily News. Torre was seen as a failed manager, a journeyman with a losing record who had been fired from 3 previous jobs. He was perceived as being too calm, too stoic, too professorial to handle the New York pressure cooker, and more importantly, the pressure from the boss. But his calm demeanor was precisely what the team needed. More than a brilliant strategist, Joe Torre was a master of people. He was a calming presence, a father figure who knew how to communicate with his players and, crucially, knew how to manage his boss. He became a human shield, absorbing George's occasional outbursts and protecting the clubhouse from the owner's volatile moods. Their relationship, built on a foundation of mutual respect, became the bedrock of the new dynasty. The magic began almost immediately. The 1996 season was a storybook run. Derek Jeter, in his first full season, was a sensation, winning the Rookie of the Year award. The team captured the AL East title and embarked on a dramatic postseason run. In the American League Championship Series against the Baltimore Orioles, a pivotal moment occurred when a 12-year-old fan named Jeffrey Mayer reached over the right field wall to catch a deep fly ball from Jeter, turning it into a controversial game-tying home run. The Yankees went on to win the series and advance to the World Series to face the powerhouse Atlanta Braves, the defending champions. After losing the first 2 games at home, the Yankees looked completely overmatched. The series shifted to Atlanta, and it was there that the young team showed its mettle, roaring back to win 3 straight games. They returned to the Bronx and in Game 6 clinched the championship. It was the Yankees' first World Series title in 18 years. The city exploded in celebration. For George Steinbrenner, it was the ultimate vindication. The owner, who had been kicked out of the game in disgrace, was now a champion once more, presiding over a new, beloved generation of Yankees. That 1996 championship was just the beginning. It was the spark that ignited one of the greatest dynasties in sports history. The 1998 team was an absolute juggernaut, a perfectly constructed machine that is still considered one of the best teams of all time. They won a then American League record 114 games in the regular season and stormed through the playoffs, winning 11 of 13 games and sweeping the San Diego Padres in the World Series. They won again in 1999, and in 2000, they achieved the ultimate New York triumph, facing their crosstown rivals, the New York Mets, in the Subway Series and winning their third consecutive championship and fourth in 5 years. The core four, Jeter, Rivera, Petit, and Posada, had become baseball royalty. Joe Torre was a managerial icon, and George Steinbrenner, the redeemed boss, reigned over it all. He was still loud. He would still occasionally criticize a player in the press, but the frantic, destructive meddling of the 1980s was gone. The constant winning had soothed the savage beast. He had found a formula that worked, a brilliant manager who could handle him, and a core of homegrown players who knew nothing but winning. His legacy, once permanently stained, was now gleaming again. As the new millennium dawned with the dynasty in full swing and his own health beginning to fade, George's focus shifted to the future of the family empire. The question of succession, once a distant concern, now became paramount. He had 4 children, Hank, Hal, Jennifer, and Jessica, and he had spent their entire lives raising them in his own image, fostering a competitive survival of the fittest environment. He had publicly praised and criticized them, just as he did his players, constantly testing their mettle. In the early 2000s, a clear heir apparent emerged. His son-in-law, Steve Swindall, married to George's daughter Jennifer. Swindall was a sharp, steady businessman who had risen through the ranks of the Steinbrenner family's non-baseball holdings. George adored him. He saw in Swindall a calm corporate leader who could manage the increasingly complex business of Yankee Global Enterprises, the holding company for the family's expanding empire. In 2005, George officially and publicly anointed Swindall as his handpicked successor. He was named chairman of the Yankees, the man who would one day sit on the throne. The succession plan seemed absolute. It was a neat, orderly transition designed to ensure stability for generations to come. George Steinbrenner, the master of chaos, seemed to have finally engineered a peaceful future for the dynasty he had built. He was on top of the world, his team was winning, his legacy was secure, and his chosen heir was in place. However, underlying tensions within the Steinbrenner family, shaped by years of competition, remained unresolved. And a sudden, shocking personal scandal was about to detonate the carefully crafted succession plan, throwing the future of the multi-billion-dollar dynasty into question and thrusting his 2 very different sons into a quiet but intense struggle for power. The mid-2000s, George Steinbrenner had achieved something that once seemed impossible, a measure of peace. His New York Yankees were perennial contenders, his redemption arc was complete, and his legacy as a winner was secure. He was a lion in winter, still capable of the occasional roar, but content to preside over the dynasty he had built and rebuilt. The final piece of his grand plan was a smooth, orderly transfer of power to his hand-picked successor, his son-in-law Steve Swindall. The future of the family empire, it seemed, was secure, but in the world of the Steinbrenners, peace was often just the quiet before the storm. The carefully constructed succession plan shattered on a warm Florida night in February 2007. Steve Swindall was arrested and charged with driving under the influence. The news of the DUI was a profound embarrassment for the image-conscious Yankees organization. But the real damage was personal. The incident precipitated Swindall's divorce from George's daughter, Jennifer, and with the dissolution of the marriage, Swindall's position as heir apparent became untenable. He was no longer family. In a swift, quiet, but ruthless move, He was bought out of his partnership stake in the team. The designated heir was out. The throne was empty. The crisis forced George's hand, reactivating the Darwinian dynamic he had spent a lifetime cultivating among his children. With Swindoll gone, he had no choice but to turn to his two sons, Henry and Harold. It was a classic Steinbrenner scenario, a power vacuum that would test which of his offspring truly had the mettle to lead. The two sons could not have been more different. The elder, Henry, or Hank, as he was universally known, was a throwback, a true echo of his father. He was brash, passionate, and hilariously, often brutally outspoken. Hank loved the game of baseball, and he loved talking about it, often to the delight of the New York media and the chagrin of the team's front office. He would publicly question player performance, lament the team's lack of fire, and make bold proclamations that sounded as if they had come directly from the boss in his prime. Hank was the romantic, the baseball purist who believed in gut instinct and old-school grit. Then there was the younger son, Harold, or Hal. Where Hank was fire, Hal was ice. Quiet, reserved, and analytical, Hal was a businessman through and through. With a master's degree in business administration, he was far more comfortable discussing television rights fees and debt service than he was debating a batting order. He had cut his teeth on the financial side of the family empire, overseeing the complex financing and construction of the billion-dollar new Yankee Stadium and managing the family's stake in the lucrative YES network. Hal was the pragmatist, the cool-headed executive who viewed the team not just as a passion project, but as a massive, complex corporation. In 2008, Major League Baseball owners officially approved the transfer of power. A tense diarchy was formed. Hank was named a co-chairman tasked with overseeing the baseball side of the operation. Hal was appointed managing general partner and chairman of Yankee Global Enterprises, giving him ultimate control over the organization's finances. It was a setup rife with potential conflict, the passionate, free-spending baseball man versus the cautious, bottom-line-oriented businessman. For a time, their competing philosophies played out in public, with reports of disagreements over player contracts and the team's willingness to exceed baseball's luxury tax threshold. While his sons jockeyed for position, George himself was fading. The once towering figure who had terrorized a generation of players, managers, and commissioners was now frail, his health in a slow, steady decline. His public appearances became rare, and when he did emerge, the booming voice was gone, replaced by a soft whisper. The lion was losing his roar. But there was one last triumph to come. In 2009, the new Yankee Stadium opened, a project overseen by Hal Steinbrenner. That same year, the Yankees won their 27th World Series title, defeating the Philadelphia Phillies. It was a moment of pure poetry. In the final year of his active leadership, the boss saw his team win one last championship in the new palace that stood as a monument to his empire. The end came just after the following All-Star break. On July 13, 2010, George Michael Steinbrenner III died of a heart attack. He was 80 years old. The sports world paused to remember a man who was both a titan and a tyrant. Tributes poured in from everyone, from the players he had tormented to the rivals he had vanquished. The consensus was clear. He was a deeply flawed, often ruthless man, but he was also a visionary who had transformed the business of sports and, above all, had kept his one sacred promise to the city of New York. He delivered winners. In a final incredible stroke of fortune, George's death occurred in 2010, the one year in modern American history when the federal estate tax had been temporarily repealed. This legislative quirk saved the Steinbrenner family an estimated $600 million in taxes, a windfall that ensured they would maintain their iron grip on the franchise for another generation. In the years following his father's death, Hal steadily consolidated his power, becoming the undisputed leader of the organization. The tense partnership with his brother softened, and in April 2020, Hank Steinbrenner passed away at the age of 63 after a lengthy illness. With his death, the last true echo of George's bombastic old-school style was gone. The Hal Steinbrenner era had truly begun. Under Hal's leadership, the Yankees have evolved. The impulsive, headline-grabbing, spend-at-all-costs philosophy of his father has been replaced by a more calculated, data-driven, and fiscally conscious approach. This new model, often criticized by fans who long for the days when the boss would spare no expense for a championship, is a reflection of a new era in baseball. It is a style of leadership that is less theatrical but is arguably more suited to the complex modern business of sport. Hal's vision has also expanded far beyond the baseball diamond. Under his guidance, Yankee Global Enterprises has aggressively diversified, transforming from a baseball team into a global sports and entertainment conglomerate. The family's controlling interest in the YEES network gives them power over their own media destiny. Their 20% stake in the New York City FC of Major League Soccer gives them a foothold in the exploding American soccer market, and their recent minority investment in the iconic Italian soccer club, AC Milan, signals a truly global ambition. The New York Yankees franchise, which George bought for about $8.8 million in 1973, is now valued at roughly $7 billion. According to recent estimates, a staggering testament to the family's enduring business acumen. Looking back on the entire Steinbrenner dynasty, what endures? It is a story of profound contradiction. Under their ownership, the Yankees captured 7 World Series titles and 11 American League pennants, a symbol of sustained excellence. But it's also the story of a patriarch whose personal scandals led to his expulsion from the game twice, a man whose ruthless tactics and public feuds created a culture of toxicity and fear. George Steinbrenner's legacy is one of profound contradiction. A tyrant who berated employees and a philanthropist who quietly gave away millions. A visionary who ushered in the big money era of modern sports, and a vindictive man who used his immense power to settle petty scores. Ultimately, the Steinbrenner story is about the price of greatness. The transition of power to his sons revealed the profound impact of growing up in his colossal shadow. Hank reflected the fiery passion, while Hal represented the necessary evolution into a calm, corporate steward. It reminds us that empires are often built on a foundation of both brilliance and brutality, and that the relentless pursuit of victory can exact a heavy toll on personal integrity and family unity. George Steinbrenner's shadow still looms over the Bronx, a complex and enduring monument to a man who was loved, hated, but never forgotten. He was and forever remains the eternal boss.